Welcome to the Time Zero podcast. I'm your host, Guy Wilcox. We're here in the beautiful Kirkland Art Center in Clinton, New York, with the poet Cindy Day. Cindy is the 2008 recipient of the Emerging Poets Award from Stone Community Magazine, and we are celebrating her wonderful collection, AMENDS, on the eve of a new collection of poetry coming out from Doubly Mad Complicated Things. So, welcome, Cindy.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's really great to have you. It was a delight discovering your work and reading it. I don't say this often because I think I have a grudging suspicion of a lot of new poets, especially when they're somewhat local, but I was floored by your work. I was very touched by this collection which balances kind of economy of language with beautiful visual world and a lot of powerful themes. And something that I hope we can talk about a little bit in your craft is a lot of these poems leave me with a sucker punch at the end. I feel like I got the wind knocked out of me by the time I get to the last line. And maybe throughout the course of the conversation, if it happens, we can discover a little bit of how you conceive of a poem and recognize that you have something in the hopper, because that's a little bit of a structural through line, I find, in your work. But let me just start by framing up a little bit of your biography, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Okay. We can never precisely start at the beginning, and even your newer work kind of goes back to your origins. But you're from Connecticut originally.
Mm-hmm.
Hartford.
Yep.
And here we are in the greater Utica area. Can you speak a bit about what it meant coming to the Mohawk Valley and how that might have, affected your work and life?
Well, I married a man from Utica, New York, and it was during a period where he was a college teacher, and it was during a period where it was tough for them to get jobs as they were often overqualified, and he was. So we needed to move away from Connecticut, which is an expensive state, and his family was here in Utica. And he was not exactly happy to go back, but we moved here, and the first things I noticed about it coming up to visit was the closeness of family and the neighborhoods. I had a 3-year-old daughter, and I could walk over to my sister-in-law's house and, have holidays and stuff. And it was just a down-home kind of place, as everybody knows who lives here. So as far as how it affected my work, I started writing seriously here. I learned some techniques here from a few friends and my husband as well, and my then husband. It's a totally different landscape. It definitely was culture shock. I definitely got lost on Genesee Street because all the cross streets are named differently. So you never know where you're going. But it's many years later now, but I really love it here. So.
Was that the 1970s?
Yeah.
So it's a little surprising. Can you talk about the culture shock between Hartford and Utica? What was shocking?
Hartford is and was a very wealthy, it was the insurance capital of the country, and very wealthy. There were just a big downtown, a lot of events, culture. I went to a good school. I don't know. It's hard to put into words.
Utica's experiencing a bit of a renaissance right now,
Utica in the 70s was terrible.
It was really the downward spiral.
Yeah, and my husband actually went to work as a speechwriter for the then mayor, who was Ed Hanna, who was, I better be careful here.
You can be blunt if you like.
Well, he was crazy.
And in power for a long time.
Yes, he was. And my husband was given a little back office and sort of left there while Ed, went around putting up the Hope Tower, and it was just a small town, really, feel to it. Hartford was a big city. It's a big area and a lot of money, as I said. So this was a much different environment.
And in the new collection, Complicated Thanks, a poem appears called My Own Country, in which you really have adopted this place. And the poem features really some tremendous lyricism and honesty, some truth and insight about the place and about your life. So it feels like that the circle has been completed. Now you're a real native of Utica, now we can almost say.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right, except I think there's also a part of it that's sort of, this is it. This is where I'm going to live. And it's not entirely okay. But it's that feeling that, yeah, this is where you're going to be. I'm very fond of that poem, and it took a long time to write, and it's an old poem. But it still pertains, I think.
I know what you mean when you say, I think at least I know in part, I know my own experience about what you mean when you say it's not completely okay, because
the poet is lurking around, sort of unwelcome. I don't know if you remember that part, and
sure.
No worries if you don't.
Like a camouflage snake.
Right. That's the little part in there that I don't belong. I don't belong here. I'm a poet, and to this day, I have felt this is an alien environment, pretty much. People really don't, at least where I am, people don't like poetry very much.
Right. I think there's...
and they're afraid of it almost. Yeah.
A dirty word, poetry.
I don't know, somewhere in grade school they got a bad dose, because it's just amazing. I have very dear friends who, if I bring up anything, the word, they are like, they just become completely silent. They just turn away.
Yeah.
And they love me. It's nothing personal.
Right.
It's like, oh my God, what is she talking about? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that maybe that's a bigger
take
subject.
That out too.
Well, it's a big subject that I think people would say that they listen to music that's impactful, and they would want to expose themselves to interesting artwork.
Yeah, I think the interest in visual arts is strong here, and
yeah.
I do think music is strong here. Yeah.
So then there must be some cultural paradigm in which there's, once bitten, twice shy, or that there's something about, peeling the layers of the onion and getting into, the high art or the pith of poetry that is alarming or scary, or people stiff arm it.
I'm glad I thought this might come up later, but I want so badly for people to feel welcome to poetry, and for poetry to be written that reaches people. And sometimes when I read my own poetry, I do feel that it reaches people. When I read it, if I say anything about it, not so much. But I think poetry has become very difficult for a lot of people to access. This is a perfect place to talk about that, These are not unintelligent people. There's nothing against the people. It's just they're so wary of it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, something that welcomes us about this book is that it begins with a journey from here, heading south, and we're allowed to go on that journey with you. And I'm wondering, maybe this is an appropriate moment for you, if you're open, to read a poem from this collection.
Sure.
I keep circling back to a poem called White August. Would you mind?
No.
There we are.
Get my glasses and would help.
Please.
White August. Mostly I thought about cigarettes, how many were left, the 4 times a day I could smoke, and how soon I could get out. That July and August the weather was white. A haze had fallen over the world, and in the haze, we, the locked up, listened for the keys to ring in the nurse's hand. The sign mid-morning had come, the opening of door 32, our passage to the pavilion where I sat apart and smoked 3 Winstons in 15 minutes, enough to get me through a few paranoid chats, us against them mutinies, interrogations. What was I in for? Staying behind in the ward never occurred to me. Not smoking never occurred to me. I was able to lock myself up, sit in the day room by the hour with my book amidst a mix of disco, crow, cats, mosquito, trees full of monkeys, and read the same sentence 20 times before its meaning spelled itself out like tiles on a Scrabble board. And a new set of letters stood propped before me. Although I admired the woman who ran away, I stayed put. It was scarier out there, the place I began to call the other side. Anyway, they brought the woman back.
That's an example, thank you, of another poem that ends with a feeling of a jolt, not a punchline precisely, but a feeling of charge and a feeling like, for me anyways, like, whew, when the wind gets knocked out of you. Is that something you discover while you're writing the poem, or is that a way in? Yeah.
Not a way in.
Not a way in.
No. The way in for me usually is a tiny thing, a very particular thing, something somebody says or does, or something I see, or it could be anything.
There's a number of recurring words and images in this collection, and one that I don't know if I'd ever consciously thought of, but when I read you writing about it, I said, I know exactly what you mean. And one of those is this idea of ill-fitting clothes, and that it's a proxy almost for an ill-fitting life. And other people, and other is yet again another word that comes up quite a lot, whether it's in Other House or Plans Are for Others, that there is other people wear clothes naturally. Other people don't have to think about it.
I was trying to place it, yeah.
For you, or for the poet's voice in this collection, there's a feeling of being ill at ease, which manifests in different ways, whether it's in a failed marriage or a sense of discomfort, or in addiction, which comes up quite a lot. I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about the title, Amends, and I think we all have associations with the word, but how did this come to be, this collection? What does it mean for you?
Part of what is a big part of the book is I'm a member of AA. And it took me a long time to recognize that I had a problem with drinking. And I started writing about recovery from alcoholism many years after I'd come into recovery. It took a long time for me to get back on my feet again and to give up the old life and to become, really, it's a program of change and revolution in when I get really on a soapbox about it. It's a kind of inner revolution because you have to change yourself to such an enormous degree. To get to amends, amends are part of the 12-step program, which I assume some people are familiar with. Everybody who enters AA is encouraged to go through the 12 steps. And I believe it's the 8th step is the amends step, where you are, after you've done some self-examination and you've worked on the steps and you've changed a little bit, you are asked to make a list of all the people you have harmed in your life. Not to go and apologize to them necessarily. Most times you can't. But most of us have done pretty selfish things. Alcoholics suck the air right out of the room. They get into a lot of trouble with people. They are willful. In other words, they want what they want when they want it. Another little expression. So you make the list of amends, and if you can make amends, if you don't hurt anybody by telling on yourself about something that happened, then great, but most of the time you don't go to the people and tell them. You do it to, like to get rid of it, to let go of it. So I began writing poems about the 12 steps. That's actually the 8th step, and I called it Amends. And hope I haven't talked too long about that.
I thank you for sharing that. I was listening to a conversation with the Irish poet Seamus Heaney recently, the late great poet, and he mentioned that how he'd boiled it down with poetry was that there were 3 kind of difficult parts. One was getting started, one was keeping going, and another part was getting started again. And so you had been writing for many years. You're able to keep that going, and even through recovery, get started up writing again, and in a way take on a whole new subject. Is it fair to say in some way kind of found your subject, or how does that interrelate, would you say?
Well, actually, I don't want to write about alcoholism too much anymore.
Yeah.
I think I've said and done what I could. My poor brother, who went through some of it, and I don't mean he's an alcoholic, I mean he's my brother, so he knew. He says, will you please stop writing those poems? And I said, okay, I promise soon. So I'm actually, right now, I'm really open to different subjects and doing different things.
The little bit of the new work that I've read feels like, and I mentioned this to you, that you've really opened the aperture of your work. It feels more expansive. Not that the work in Amends doesn't pull in lots of life, but it is thematically focused, even if it ranges across years and different people. So I'm excited for the new collection. Something else that's happening recently is in the next few weeks is that Doubly Mad magazine is going to publish a series of letters, correspondence with an ex-partner of yours who's also quite a well-known poet, Hayden Carruth. I'm excited about those letters, and I'm glad for you that they'll see the light of day. My one question is, as you went through this period where, as you've alluded to, maybe there were some kind of roller coaster emotions or ups and downs of life. When you were with Hayden, what was it like having 2 poets in the household, and how did that affect your work, his work? What was the working dynamic?
That's a really good question. Well, I was a graduate student, and he, of course, was an accomplished, published poet. So eventually, at first, it was wonderful. And I don't regret so much of it because I met so many people and interesting people, and he could be a magical person and a fun person. But sooner or later, it was difficult to see myself as separate and to work as an individual. And, we had this habit of giving each other our fresh work. His office was down the hall, and, we would show each other work, and I worked so hard, and I probably was learning a lot, but at the time it just felt like, what am I doing? I can't compete with this guy. And I didn't like the public life. We went to a lot of events. I just wasn't, because I wasn't on the same level. I couldn't be. And that's nobody's fault. That's, I met him in grad school. We had coffee. One thing led to another. But he was a very down-to-earth kind of guy most of the time. But then he'd go into his genius phase and, good God help you. So I would say I probably learned more about poetry than I could have imagined. I had an inside, view or experience. But at the same time, I became smaller and smaller, and women would come up to me and say, geez, what are you doing? So that would make me feel terrible. There was a lot of judgment, so.
So it came to an end.
Yeah, it definitely came to an end. Crash. Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, it wasn't long after that crash when you got into recovery. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say it was about 3 or 4 years later. Yeah.
Something that is incredibly touching about this particular volume, I'm going to hold it up again so everyone can see it's beautiful artwork as well,
Yeah.
is...
Let me give a thanks to Vij Berry. Did a great job for me. Yeah.
And Vij is from here as well.
Vij works in media at Hamilton College, and she's a painter. So,
It's lovely work.
yeah.
For a volume that is, comparatively slender,
Yeah.
maybe there's 30-odd pages here, you do take us on quite a journey. We get a number of decades compressed, and there's kind of what feels like the present moment, and then going back through time, and then emerging across a span of decades to the final poem in the volume, The Sacred Tables, which has a lot of lovely Utica moments. Cafe Domenico is present.
Have to put them in there.
Got to represent Cafe Domenico
Yeah.
in the collection, and then, but also there's kind of a new gravitas about your person, your character in that poem, because you, and I think you used the word kind of uncool. There's something uncool about you, but also grounded and responsible and helpful.
That's true.
Without trying to, put, it. I guess what I'm curious about is your poetic work in this volume and your life are so interlinked. Are there moments where you feel like it's not quite autobiographical and we shouldn't view it as such, or does it feel intimately interlinked in a confessionalist style like we might find with, Anne Sexton or Robert Lowell or Sylvia Plath?
I was thinking about the confessional style before this. I was just sort of thinking about poetics, people's styles, and what I had to say about that. And I really dislike the confessional poets for the most part. I'm not a big fan. I was greatly influenced by Sylvia Plath way back in the 60s, early 70s, when she first came out. I think everybody was. Certainly women were. So when I started writing, when I write any poems now, I worry every time, because my subject, I think, is so usually pretty close to me. And there's a wonderful man who directs the Downtown Writers Center in Syracuse, Phil Memmer, who talks to the I that is not I in the poems, because there's lots of I poems, and it's me, but it's not me. And I try to make it not just about me. I think what I've come to is my subjects are my family. And it's not a conscious decision, but I am still trying to figure them out. And I come back to that subject a lot, I think. I think that certainly shows in the work. But sometimes it's just, I really try to just write very objectively about, I'll get an idea or an image It has nothing to do with my family or my past or people in my life. It's just about something. And there's some of those in the larger collection too. Like the first thing that comes to mind is a poem I wrote about a deer coming out of the woods onto the sidewalk. And the poem is sort of just the deer walking around the clapboard houses and, trying to get food. And I end it by saying something like, I want to explain to the deer why we messed up his world. So something like that is very different. And I'm trying for that because I think there's too much of the I, me. My dreams, please.
I think that you're able to toe that line. I think that one of the reasons I'm so drawn to the work is, especially with moments, how you handle, with a real economy of language, your mother in her hospital room, your father having a cigarette. These are moments where there's specificity and I can see the outlines emerge of your own personal life, but we also recognize these as emblematic, on some level, figures, people that we know from our own lives, and I think that's what makes the work successful.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cindy, thank you.
Thank you.
So much for this work, for joining us here today.
Thank you.
Very excited about Complicated Thanks. This work, Amends, is available from Finishing Line Press. We're going to put a link down in the show notes so you can pick up a copy and discover the other writers who are there. Stick around. Cindy's also going to read to us a poem from really the actual center of this collection, and I think it also in many ways really the heart of the collection, called The Red House, Late March. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been great. Thanks.
It's a pleasure.
This poem is called The Red House, Late March. 1. The Wrong Husband. How much misfortune precedes a bad marriage? I was a girl hurrying from the red house to the woods and below to the pond, jumping into the water, scorning my aunts who lowered themselves in carefully with little squeals. Then school, a dance, a few drinks, a car taking the turns too fast. Next I stood as white as the altar, vowing to live with the wrong husband. I did and said things I regretted. Ages passed and I didn't know how to anything. Recover, repay, return, resume. 20-some years. The house we called red because it is red, in one of the few direct observations my family ever made, is quiet when I arrive, though the surrounding pines wave their branches like great shaggy beasts, and below them the pond is piebald. I'm thinking I was mistaken coming back when I turn and see my cousin Nate walking up the worn drive, the image of my father, and the old love seizes me. He used to row us out to the middle of the pond and bait our lines, a small lesson in patience and timing we never learned well. We can't call up the fish comes when it will. Today, Nate welcomes me as if I had been away a few days, that's all. 2, the cocktail hour. The windy afternoon blows back the years, girl with a fish, girl at a school, girl swinging between the arms of the lawn chairs as Mom and Dad talk with Nate and Dorothy about relatives and money, blaming those absent for everything, from looking exactly alike to alcoholism, complaining about the heat, the rain, the car, the post office, middle age, the clink of their glasses, the dogs whining, impatient for a walk, my father's cough as he lights another cigarette, now sacred, sublime quotidian. The waving pines, their soft floors, how I ran across the yard and came to a dead stop at my mother, leaned against her or passed my hand over her hand, just to be sure as she sat beside the thick woods, the still moss-colored pond. 3. The pond. By midsummer, the pond was warm and felt like swimming in thick, green-black bathwater. It glinted here and there with tiny stars and streams of fractured sunlight. Sometimes, as I let myself sink a little, tired from kicking and pulling with my arms all the way from the dock to the float, I'd feel a slimy length across my leg and cry out, "Snake!" But the grown-ups talking on the dock called back, "It's just a reed, the tail of a lily pad. There are no snakes," they cried. They failed to convince me, though by then we had entered and returned safely from many bodies of water, lakes and oceans, rivers, pools. We had crossed on boats and leapt from diving boards. We had learned to see under salt water and how to walk on stony floors. I loved to swim and needed to believe the calls from shore, but the pond was like no other body in its mossy solidity, its gravity, and because we owned it, it was ours. The unseen monster crossed my leg and clung to me as I kicked hard to free myself. I climbed the ladder to the dock and lay trembling from cold and fear in the sun, pressing my cheek against the warm, worn, dry wood, listening to the family's voices as they continued the endless conversation, sitting with their drinks beside the piles of oars, the fishing rods, the orange life preservers, the blue-green dragonflies darting back and forth on the pond's surface weightlessly. 4. They were afraid to stop talking because if they did, they would have to see what was happening underwater, feel the snake. After the first drink, Dad was drunk. We pretended not to notice and even offered him another. Mother, her arm draped over the chair, went on talking with Auntie Dot about the awful things, illness, mistakes, divorces, long train rides, ill-fitting clothes, bad cooking, bad neighborhoods. Beyond these lay all the things that could never be said, waiting quietly, like the pond, like we imagine the dead, as souls lingering with us. 5, the house. In 1921, it was an abandoned schoolhouse on some 100 acres of land. I'm sure my uncle bought it for a song. He and Dottie turned the one-room school into an open kitchen, scene of so many Thanksgivings and Sunday dinners. The living room with its view of the birches staggering down to the pond. And here it stands on my return one March afternoon, fulfilling its mission to endure. Nate is here, a son, and I, a daughter. But the curse of buying and selling was uttered long before. Nate's weathered face and bow-legged walk show the effort of it. He can't bring back our brothers, sisters, little cousins scattered all over the country. He keeps inviting us, and a few come back like me. Some, I hear, have turned mean. Some religious. Some have moved to the West Coast, and others refuse to stay in touch. Yet after dinner, taking one of 4 paths through the woods, I reach the pond and see Dad on the dock as he was. Not a ghost, but my love for him. His thinning black hair combed back, sitting alone, cross-legged on an aluminum chair and gazing into the woods. He brings his cigarette to his mouth, inhales deeply, lets the smoke out in one burst. It circles, hangs in the air, the life of my father, and dissolves there.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We'd like to give our own uncomplicated thanks to the Kirkland Arts Center for the generous use of the space. If you enjoyed this literary content and would like more, make sure to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and to enact your own literary adventure, make sure to visit us at timesarrow.org. Happy reading.